Hello there. My name is H.L.G. Wallace, and I am a fantasy writer and a poet. And this is Fantasy Talk, so it's just like a space where I just talk about fantasy stuff, regardless of kind of what genre what kind of medium it's in. And I won't lie, I think for this first one, I did definitely struggle to try and find like the right initial kind of IP or just thing to talk about, and there were a couple of things that I'd kind of started to talk about or think about, like Dark Souls 2, or I'm currently playing Fire Emblem on the Game Boy Advance, or I'm playing on an emulator, but it's that game, but I haven't finished it. So as you can see from the title, I ended on Vampire Hunter D Bloodlust, which, in my opinion, I think like for the longest time I've had like the holy grail at the top three like anime films, and it's always been Vampire Hunter D Bloodlust, Akira, and Redline. And yeah, like those three are just like incredible. So yeah, I mean, like, to be honest, you can't really go with Bloodlust, and I think it's, as I kind of said in the first one, I did want to talk about like lesser known things, and I think Bloodlust is one of those films where if you know it, you love it, but I don't think it's like huge. So like, I think another thing I was trying to like decide in between kind of recording the first episode and this one is whether or not I'd kind of do spoilers or like how I'd want to do it, and I think my idea is that I'm just going to talk about like all the details I want to talk about, and if that kind of spoils it for someone, or if it kind of, I don't know, if it kind of ruins it for people in some way, then fair enough. I think to a certain extent you can only have something like spoiled so much. But yeah, so it's kind of, I'm not really holding myself back on what I talk about. So let's get into it. So yeah, Vampire Hunter D Bloodlust. The premise of it is pretty simple. It's kind of just like a chase. So there's a vampire, like immediately at the beginning, it's a vampire called Maya kidnaps a woman. I can't remember her name. Oh no, it's not Layla. Anyway, he kidnaps a woman, and then the family hires D, the vampire hunter, to get her back. But they also say how they've hired another kind of group of vampire hunters called the Marcus Brothers to like get her back as well. So the whole film is kind of them just chasing after this couple, and you learn kind of early on that in fact this like vampire human couple are in love, and they're trying to like escape the earth, or they're trying to escape to like find a space where they could kind of like love each other and not be judged for like obvious reasons. And it's, I don't know, it's the way it kind of builds up. I've watched it so many times, so I know kind of all the little details, and I can't remember the effect the first time, but like it's such a cool idea, especially for a vampire story, because I feel like, I don't know, like I don't think, actually I'd say kind of with like the generic kind of the big monsters, vampires are usually the ones that have the most like love stories, but I don't know, there's something about this one, it just kind of works really well, and you kind of do believe that they genuinely like care for each other. So I made some notes whilst I was watching it, because I literally just watched it now. And my top one is on kind of character design, and it's, I don't know if you call it like an art style. Obviously it's like an anime film, but it's so beautiful, like everything, like the immediate beginning of the film is kind of a panning shot over a city where it's just covered in like crosses all over like the roofs and stuff, and just the general, I don't know, like vibe of it, because that's the thing, it is a fantasy film, and I like kind of to double check, I read the back of the DVD, and it says how it like melds like horror and fantasy, but I've actually read one of the books, because there's, I don't know how many stories, but like there's a bunch of like short stories or like novels for Vampire Hunter D, And it's got such a weird vibe to it, because part of it is kind of like a dystopian, part of it's kind of a western, and there's obviously a lot of like fantasy elements, like you have kind of like magic and obviously vampires, but werewolves and a lot of kind of tropes and stuff. So it's one of those things where it kind of stands alone because it melds so much together, but nothing really fights each other. It all kind of works quite well, because so one of the kind of easiest kind of distinctions is that like D as a character, he wears this like full length, I don't know if it's leather, but it's like this black outfit, and he's got like a big kind of fedora like hat and a cape and stuff, and he wields a sword. So he's very like fantasy based, and he rides a horse, but because it's like this weird meld, it's a cyborg horse, which is really cool, and it's like from the books as well. And it's just this kind of thing where it's like very, very stereotypical like fantasy character in a very unstereotypical world, and then to contrast that you have the Marcus brothers, who's the other like vampire hunters, and they're super sci-fi. Like they've got this like armor-clad truck, and some of them use kind of like melee weapons, but like the main character you know from there is a woman called Layla, and she has this weird like, I don't know, like this kind of sci-fi gun, but I'll kind of get onto that later. But yeah, it's really, really cool, and yeah, so like I think it's the way they kind of run everything is really cool, and like I think the immediate action that you come across in the film is when the Marcus brothers kind of get to a town, and like I'm assuming it was like hours. Oh no, it was 2 days. 2 days after Maya the vampires kidnapped the woman, and so like they kind of the Marcus brothers get there, and they try and talk with the guy, and it turns out he's been turned, and they call them zombies, but like they're really not, I don't know, they're really not like zombies, in the sense that like I think it makes more sense to say they're like lesser vampires, because they're strong enough to rip like steel, I don't know, panels off their armored car, and they're like kind of, they've got the fangs and the long nails, and they're super quick and they're really strong, and so it's an interesting idea on like a zombie, where it is obviously they're like a mindless person, where that kind of free will has been taken away from them, but they're more kind of vampiric than a traditional kind of like rotting corpse zombie. But one thing that I noticed, kind of obviously before, I don't really make notes when I watch films, so it's probably because of that, but like one thing I thought about was like, I wonder how like the vampire, like Maya, did it or changed, because it's a whole village or a whole town that's been turned into these kind of like vampire zombies. And I think obviously one thing is like he just bites them in the neck, but I'm curious if kind of in this world there's a way of turning people, I don't know, almost like indirectly turning people, because the immediate thing is like the first character you come across is like, who's this like vampire zombie, he looks like just a drunk guy sitting next to a well. So I don't know, there was a part of me where I was like, I wonder if like he could have tampered with the blood, the water or something, like maybe with his blood, something like that. It's a question that's not really asked, and it's something that's not really answered. But I don't know. It's a really kind of interesting idea, and you don't really see them after that, because the kind of characters like D and the Marcus brothers, they delve deeper and deeper into kind of just like vampire territory basically. So there's less kind of humans to turn into stuff. But yeah, but it's really cool. And like there's, I mean, your introduction to D, because I mean you first kind of come across him, but he's acting all like cool when he's taking the contract to like find the girl. I really should find out what her name is. Anyway, yeah, and like so it's very much like him acting cool, but like I'd say his proper introduction is when the Marcus brothers are like running away from this town of like vampire zombies. They get stuck, so then they just have to like fight a bunch of them on a hill. And as they're like kind of talking afterwards, they kind of sense that someone's like approaching. So one of them like fires an arrow, and it's such a cool. I don't think it's a panning shot, but it kind of stays with the arrow as it's like like zipping past the gravestones on this hill, and then Dee like catches it, and he kind of like rears back on his horse, and his cape goes and like flows out, and it looks really cool. And then there's like a little interaction between the two where they're like, "What's your name?" And he's like, "D." And then he rides off. But yeah, so there's a lot of stuff in this film where I think like there's not a lot of fat in it. Like they don't really mess around much. But there are a lot of moments, especially with D, where he's just being cool. He's just kind of being like a cool guy. And another big thing kind of with him is like, and like they kind of say it from the get-go, but so D is half human and half vampire, and I'm almost certain in the book they called him a Damphnir, which I know is from like real world folklore or mythology, whichever one folklore anyway. But in the film they call him a Dampeel, which I don't know where that comes from, because like I can't remember, because I listened to an audiobook for Vampire Entity, and I'm almost certain in that they called him a Damphnir as well. So maybe there is something kind of like, not legally, but maybe there was something where there was they felt like that they couldn't use that kind of terminology. But it's so like the immediate kind of beginning of it is a lot of like investigation, trying to figure out like where they're going, what's going on. But it's one of those things where, because I watched this again fairly recently with some friends, and when I watched it that time, it made me think of like, seen from the other side, it's such an interesting film in that, like, so Maya and his lover, they think they're I don't know, like it is kind of a selfish story on their end where they're doing this thing because they love each other and they know they can't be together any other way. So to do so, they like destroy a town, and the woman's brother, like they chase after her, then Maya like kills them all and stuff. So there's like so much death around their pursuit. But I'd love to kind of see that story from like the other side, where it is just this kind of like twisted love story where it's like this forbidden love, and all they kind of have is each other, but in order to achieve that they have to like destroy so much. And they actually talk about it at the end of the film, where she's kind of saying how she's like, we've given up so much just to get here, and like right now I don't even know if like it was worth it. And it's so cool, because I think there's a lot of kind of villains now in films where they want to have that kind of thing where they don't see themselves as the villain, they see themselves as the hero of their own story, and they're trying to do, I don't know, what's right by them. And I think that can work, but I don't think it works for like every character. And I think there's elements of that in this story where they're not doing it to like be evil, and they don't really want to kill anyone, but it's something where they're willing to like destroy a town, or like kill countless people, or like just destroy themselves in a way, just to kind of have what they want. So it's a really interesting like dynamic between like the hero and like the quote unquote villains of the story, kind of, even if you'd say that. And it's like I think I said already, but like, the art in this film is just incredible. Like I think it's from the 90s. Like it's something where I feel like they just don't make films like this anymore, and it makes me sound so old. But it's just kind of, there's so much detail in everything, and like even if a character doesn't even make it to like halfway in the film, or it's just like a passing thing, like passing town, or like a moment, like there's so much detail in everything in this world, and like so much care has clearly been put in to like make everything look really cool, but also like just have some kind of sense to it. So I mean, like, I think the next kind of point of the story is Dee and the others kind of find this resting house where the vampire and his girlfriend are like waiting out the sun, basically. And it's another one of those things where it's like in this kind of jungly, foresty kind of area, and it's just this like mirrored box. And so it's like super sci-fi, and there's like laser, but like there's lasers, but they shouldn't have eyes. So again, it's that kind of like mix between, I don't know, sci-fi, but like fantasy tropes almost. And then from there, the kind of like chase carries on. And like the immediate kind of goal of the couple is to get to a thing called the Barbaroi, which is like, it's just a collection of monsters. And again, it's one of those things where, and I'm not really sure how they even do it, but there's just such subtle, you can tell like it's such a ancient, not organization, but like collection of creatures. And it's, so like there's a point where they're all kind of huddled around and Dee has made his way in and he's talking with their leader. And like there's one of them where I don't even know, it kind of looks like a ghoul, but in this like moment of tension, it just like shakes its shoulders and makes this weird noise. And it's really funny because I feel like it's trying to be like intimidating, but it's just like too small to be scary. But you kind of got like everything. Like there's just like these hulking kind of weird creatures and like lizard men and snake women, and like the leader of it is I don't know, like he's one of those creatures where he's on a unicycle. He's just like talking to Dee and kind of trying to be threatening. And he's got like a jester's cape where it kind of goes down to the points with like the baubles. But like he looks human, and you can tell that he isn't. And I don't think he does anything to kind of show you his like monstrous side. But obviously the fact that he's the leader of the Barbaroi like says a lot. But yeah, and like and then in that kind of like scene or in that moment, you kind of meet the next like 3 antagonists of the film, which are, again, this isn't like a facts kind of thing, so it's just me like chatting. So I've written them down as Shadow Man, Nature Woman, and Awesome Werewolf. So it's like, yeah, like there's kind of one of them is just, and I think this is a real kind of 90s anime trope, where he's just got like a bit of a whiny voice, and he's like the villain. He's like, like, you can't get me kind of thing, but I think it's even whinier than that. But like he can like cloak himself in shadows and like swim through them and stuff. And the other one, I don't know if she's kind of supposed to be like a nymph, like a dryad or something, but she's very much like nature-based, where her body can turn into like different elements and things. And then the last one is a werewolf, and his design is like honestly one of my favorite designs from anything ever. So like normally when he's just kind of like in human form, he still looks a bit like wolf, kind of bestial, with like shaggy hair and like hairy arms and kind of claw-like fingers. But then when he turns into a werewolf, he kind of gets the full body of hair, and I think his head kind of gets a bit more like beast-like, but from his stomach this just giant like wolf mouth grows out of him, and he can like, yeah, it's one of those things where it's like feels so impractical, and it's just so like, I don't know, it's just such a weird design, but it works so well. And there's a point where he literally does the classic like jumps into the top of a cliff and like howls at the moon, but he's like howling from this giant mouth in his stomach, and it just looks amazing. Yeah, and it's, I don't know, like, yeah, it just works really well. And like he's also like, you see some other stuff where he can kind of like, I don't know, shift his eyes and like see through stuff. So he's a really, really cool character. And yeah, so what else have I got? Oh yeah, and then so another point in the Barbaroi, when Dee's chatting with the leader, and they're basically just being like, you're cool in that, but you are going to die. You kind of come across, because in the Marcus Brothers, you have like the leader of it who's got this like funky, I don't know, it's like a crossbow kind of bow arm, where it's these two kind of like arms. Yeah, I'd say it's closer to like a bow than a, well, either way. It's a thing that shoots stuff. But like the way he kind of does it, he just grabs hands full of like these metal, like silver arrows, and then just rapid fire shoots them. And then who else do you have? You have a guy, I think it's called Noel, who is just like this hulking guy, and because they're like against vampires, they've all got a cross, but he's got like a white cross painted on his face. And then there's another guy called Kyle, who's a lot quicker, and he has like daggers, and he can throw like shuriken kind of things. And then there's a guy called Grove, who for the first part, he's just like sat in this bed, and he's kind of got like an IV drip, or like he's being supported some way, and he's really like frail. And then you have like Layla, who, yeah, she's the main kind of character from the Marcus Brothers, and she's really cool because she's just like, she's a bit hot-headed, but she's got this like sick, I don't know, like red, it's kind of like a biker suit or something, but it's got these really cool kind of like black and white looped design on the shoulder pads. It's kind of very sci-fi, and like I was saying with her sci-fi gun, it's this like chunky thing, like slab of a gun, and it's got like these little like piston looking things on it, but it doesn't shoot bullets. It shoots like not force fields. Like there's points where it will shoot kind of just an orb of like black energy, then sometimes it will just shoot like in a force, like a wave. But yeah, so it's like, but yeah, Layla's really cool. But the point I was kind of talking about is when he was at the Barbaroi, he's kind of surrounded and screwed, and then it's going back and forth between like Dee and the Marcus Brothers, and they're like setting up Grove to kind of do something. They're injecting him with something, and then suddenly you see this kind of like angelic spirit version of Grove floating through this space. He's got these orbs around him, and he's just like shooting lasers at everyone. So that's kind of how Dee gets away, and then like that kind of starts the next leg of the chase. And yeah, but it's really cool because it's like, I don't know, like you just see, it's another kind of, it's presented as like sci-fi because he's like injected and all this stuff, but it feels very like spiritual and like fantasy in the fact that it's like astral projection almost, but like an aggressive version of astral projection, if you will. Yeah, so that's what happens there. And then oh yeah, one thing I kind of put in is that like on the next leg of the chase, basically kind of both sides, so like Dee and the Marcus Brothers both get a bit messed up, and like Dee loses his horse, so he kind of wanders into the next town over, and he like finds another horse, and it's one of those things where like I felt there was a real like parallel between Dee and the Geralt, the Witcher, in the way that like they're both monster hunters, but they're both really kind of on the outskirts of like society, and I think that's quite common for like the hunter archetype. But it's the way they kind of do it in this film is basically Dee buys another cyborg horse from an old man, and they threaten him, basically being like, oh, we don't want dump heels in here, and you can kind of like take your money, you can't have the horse, we can't sell to you. And there's a real standoff, and then basically the old guy starts talking, and he's saying how like, oh, do you remember when a bunch of kids were kidnapped by a vampire, and like how they were saved? And the sheriff, who's like much younger, is like, yeah, no, I remember that. And then basically the old man just out of the blue pulls out this like meaty rifle, points at the sheriff's head, and he's like, you're gonna let that dump hill go because like I was one of those kids at the like that was kidnapped, and he was the one who saved me. And it's like, and I always felt bad for that. And I thought it was such a cool moment where like I think it does so much. Like it shows that like it further kind of instilled Dee's like prowess at his job. It shows how kind of old he is, in the sense that like this is an old man talking about something that happened when he was a kid. So like, I don't know, maybe like 60, 70 years ago. But I think also it kind of just instills how like that's always been his life. And yeah, and so it's like, obviously like he kind of gets away and kind of gets the horse and kind of does the whole thing. But I don't know, like I think this film is really clever in kind of how it uses kind of characters and stuff, and I don't know, like I think it's just really cool basically. And like I think for the most part there's some kind of interactions and there's more fighting, but like I feel kind of what I'd want to talk about is like the end part is, so turns out at the end of it that the couple are going to a character called Carl Miller's castle. And obviously, like I said, I've watched this so many times, but like I always forget how cool it is, how cool her castle is, because it's like this giant kind of, I don't know, almost like steampunk, sci-fi, gothic, fantasy castle, and it's huge, and it's got these like massive spider-like leg structure things like to keep it up almost, and then kind of from the outside it's this really imposing thing, and then as you kind of get in, you see that like it's basically just like a city in like one kind of thing, like in one structure, and yeah, and like but then once you get inside it's all very like pretty, and like there's kind of, it's very regal, but like the character of Carmilla herself is really interesting because she's called like, I think like the Blood Queen or something. And it's one of those things where I think, well, I know that Carmilla was an actual story, and I've started to listen to the audiobook, but I never finished it. And it's one of those things where apparently Carmilla, or the story of Carmilla, came before Dracula. So she's like one of the older kind of vampire characters. And yeah, and she's kind of, so she's this like imposing vampire queen, and she's kind of what you think she'd be, where she's kind of got this long flowing red dress, she's got her hair's done up in this, I don't know, it almost looks like a bolt or just like a tube of hair on top of her head, and yeah, and like the story kind of goes is that like she would kind of sacrifice people for her beauty, or at least I know that the real inspiration, and I can't remember the real woman's name, is that like there was a queen somewhere, and she would want, like, in order to kind of like maintain her beauty, she would sacrifice kind of peasant girls and like bathe in their blood, and it's mental. So I am assuming they've taken heavy inspiration from that. But like when they're kind of in, and it's one of those things where she is acting all nice and she welcomes the couple, then almost immediately starts fucking with them. So she like kills Maya and kidnaps the girl that I still can't remember her name. And yeah, and so like, and then kind of from there it's a bit of like a clusterfuck, and everyone's after everyone, and eventually kind of Dee comes across essentially like the spirit of Carmilla, and she's just kind of really like putting him down, in the sense that like she was like, oh, you're half human and half vampire, but like you betrayed your vampire half. And there's a scene where like there's a few kind of scenes in films where it's, I don't know, like it's kind of just like a hulking moment where, I don't know, it's just a pivotal moment in like a conflict. And like the other ones is the polar bear fight and the Golden Compass. There's a point in a very obscure film called, in English it's the Knights of the Teutonic Order, but in Polish it's like H.L.G or something, but I can never say it right, where they're like, it's a whole war thing which I'm not going to get into, but like basically a father that is a head of a kind of an army is trying to find his daughter who's been kidnapped, and then at one point he hears her singing, and then when he's in the castle with like the people who kidnapped her, he's like, you've stolen my daughter, and they're like, no we haven't, and then he just goes mental, unarmed, steals someone's sword and kills like 12 people. It's crazy. But for Vampire Hunter D, it's basically Carmilla's like attacking him with lightning, And throughout the whole film, Dee was very cool, calm, and collected, like literally not raising his voice. And you can see that he's like part vampire, and everyone goes on about how he's part vampire. But I think his ears are a little pointy, but his teeth never change. But like in this point, he's like caught in her spell, being like attacked with lightning, and he's just like screwed basically. So he kind of just gives in to his vampire side. Like his eyes go red and his teeth come out, and this like growing force field comes out of him, and then he's like freed from her attacks and spells, and kind of stops Carmilla from like coming back properly. Yeah, it's so good. And then there's like kind of other back and forths and stuff, and at one point Dee and Maya finally fight each other. And again, there's another point of what I always think about as just being like super cool, where it was they're kind of fighting, like slashing each other, and then Maya's weapons are like his body, so like his cape can turn into like wings, but they can also be like hard as steel. And there's a point, he does it a couple of times, but he doesn't really attack with it, but he turns his hand, like he covers his hand in this like super gothic, sick looking like gauntlet, and just the idea of like seeing him like covered in it, it'd be it's so cool. But they're like fighting, and there's a point where Dee's sword is like clashed against Maya's wing, and they're like really holding it like face to face and like staring each other down. And I think to like show how like powerful they are and how much like tension they're putting on each other, their like two weapons start to like glow red, and it's like flaking as if they're like the steel's in like a furnace or something. And then obviously they kind of break out of it and kind of do some stuff. And another cool weapon is, so the story with Carmilla is that she's Dracula years ago kind of got tired of her shit and then like impaled her through the chest with a sword. And when you see it, it looks kind of almost like bronze. It's all just one colour, but it's like got all this like gothic kind of designs on it. It's got like a dragon head. And again, it's one of those small details where they could have had like a regular sword and it would have looked fine, but like it's so like gnarly and like vampiric and gothic, and it's so sick. And yeah, then kind of like after I think the fight, essentially they escape, and the end of the film is one of those moments where basically like earlier in the film there's like a back and forth between Dee and Layla, and she kind of gets all sentimental, and she was like, well, we're both hunters, we're in the same game, like if one of us dies before the other, let's promise to like give flowers or like put flowers on their grave, because she's so like sure that she's just going to die alone. And then like the end of the film essentially happens, and then it cuts to a funeral, and again it's like very much leaning on the Western tropes and stuff, where everyone kind of is in that kind of attire of like shirts and trousers and like the dresses and stuff. But it's Layla's funeral, and it looks like the whole kind of town's come, and then kind of you see her granddaughter put a flower down. She looks over and she sees Dee like hiding behind a tree, and so she kind of talks to him, and like, that's the end of the film. But it's so cool, and it's one of those kind of questions that isn't really answered, where like what was her life after that? Because I think in Carmilla's castle, basically all the other Marcus brothers, all the other surviving Marcus brothers died, so she's like the only one left, and it's something where you can kind of tell that she's kind of sick of the life, but she doesn't know any other. So to kind of have that almost like at a very high cost, but have that kind of fresh start where she's kind of not tied to it. I don't think anyone really blame her for like stopping. And clearly she kind of found somewhere. She had at least one kid who had a kid of their own, and it's just a really almost like optimistic. Oh, it's a very optimistic like ending to this quite like dark and gritty film, and I think that's one of the reasons I was going to go back to it, is because it is something where there is like a lot of gore and there's a lot of kind of darker themes and stuff, but at its core, like it's I don't know. There's a lot of beauty in it, kind of visually, but like narratively. Yeah, and it's one of those films where, again, like I said at the beginning, if you know about it, you love it. If you don't know about it, you need to see it. So I think, at least for this episode, that's what I'm going to talk about for Vampire Hunter D Bloodlust. I don't know if it's online. I have it on DVD, and I have done for years. But I'm sure you could probably find it somewhere fairly easily. But if my kind of over-explanation of it has piqued your interest, then I'd highly recommend watching it. And yeah, so that's kind of this episode of Fantasy Talk. I have always still been H.L.G. Wallace. If you'd like to read any of my stuff, I mostly post on Substack under H.L.G. Wallace, and then I've got an Instagram with Homegrown Universe, and obviously this is on my YouTube channel. Thank you very much for listening, and go watch Vampire Hunter D Bloodlust.